Dear respected Thai, dear sisters and brothers, it's a cool night at Deer Park, and we just returned from the mountains, from the Sierra Nevada mountains a few days ago. We went on a walking retreat in nature, and I practiced to get in touch with my breathing and my step throughout the day. We practiced walking in silence. And we carried everything on our backs that we needed for the week. And Brother Peace was there, Brother Energy, and two of our sisters as well as Tonks. And it's so beautiful just to feel the freedom of being able to sleep in the forest and poop in the forest and know that Mother Earth is around us and within us in every moment, just like she is now. But it's a beautiful experience to do. We are 15 people, and it was exciting. Mother Earth offered many beautiful opportunities for us to experience her, like a black bear walking right by us in the meadow, and then a forest fire. Oh, thank you. And but luckily, the forest fire, we think it was started by lightning. So we watched one night, the three brothers and I, we were lying there in the meadow, and suddenly one pine tree went up like a torch. And I thought, I'm not going to get much sleep tonight. But that was kind of the most exciting thing, and then it kind of died down. And the next night I came back after dinner, and there was a rattlesnake under my hammock. So I said, okay, maybe I'll move my hammock to another tree to allow the rattlesnake to enjoy his nest, because that rock I put my hammock next to was his nest. And mainly we had a chance to not have any cell phones or internet or any kind of connection to the outside world. We had our guide, Tonks, had a emergency Garmin device that we used when we saw the forest fire. But other than that, we didn't have any contact with the outside world, and we didn't miss it at all. We felt perfectly complete. And on the fourth day, Brother Peace led us in reflecting on our ancestors. And so we enjoyed getting in touch with our ancestors while we were walking. So we imagine that all of our ancestors are there behind us, like in a stream, and our descendants are in front of us. And as we walk, we are just part of that stream, that river of ancestors. We imagine that, but that's only to help us to see what's already there, because we know that our ancestors are already in every cell of our body. And so the meditation is, it starts as a visualization of our mother, our father, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, And we can go back to something like a chimpanzee and something like a burrowing animal, something like an amphibian, reptile, something like a fish, that were our ancestors. And we are part of that stream. And this body, this particular form, is changing. It's impermanent. And so we see ourselves as this river of life. And it's very powerful to walk like that in silence with our ancestors. We know that many of our ancestors may not have had the opportunity to walk in mindfulness like that, in silence. So we walk for them. And it doesn't mean we just walk and we think about them. We actually walk for them because they are in every cell of our body. So our mindful walking is not just for our own enjoyment. It's for the enjoyment of our mother and our father and our grandparents and all of our ancestors. We know that some of our ancestors may have worked and walked and talked their whole life without being able to experience the wonder of the present moment of walking. So we do it for them. We enjoy it for them. That is our great inheritance. And many people cry. Yeah, they cried when they walk with their ancestors. But they're beautiful tears, tears of reconciliation, of understanding. And that's what I'd like to share a little bit about today in the 36th tenet. So it's about how, with the practice of mindfulness, we can store consciousness to help mature the seeds of wisdom that are already there. With the practice of mindfulness, concentration, and insight, mind consciousness can learn and download its insights to store. Leaving store to do the work of maturation. and then manifest the seeds of wisdom. That are innate in store. So we talked already about how we can make use of store consciousness to embrace difficult emotions. For example, we can call on the seed of mindfulness to come up and embrace the anger and invite it to go back down. And store consciousness is always operating. It allows us to do those things which we don't need to think about, like our heart beating. Most of the time our breathing, when we're not mindful of our breathing, it's store consciousness which allows us, it helps us to breathe. The circulation of blood through our arteries and veins, the combustion that happens in our cells, in the sense in which we speak of store consciousness, these are events that take place in our body without us having to consciously think about them. And so they're very efficient. They don't require a lot of input. But our mind consciousness actually requires a lot of energy. It's part of why our brain requires so much glucose and oxygen, massive amounts. That's why as Homo sapiens we can become easily addicted to sugar. Nowadays sugar is, refined sugar is easily available. In most of our evolutionary history, maybe the sweetest fruit was about as sweet as a carrot. And if we are lucky, maybe we would find a honeycomb, a honeybee nest, and that was the sweetest thing we could possibly imagine or experience. But now we've cultivated fruits to be very sweet over many generations, many centuries, and eventually we learned how to cultivate sugarcane and other kinds of products, and we refine it, and so now we have almost unlimited access to sugar. And our brain loves sugar, so our tongue and our body is designed to take as much sugar as possible. And this has a lot of ramifications for life in our present-day society. Because we can grow a lot of sugar, because we have a lot of fossil fuels, so it transforms itself into our body if we're not careful, and way more sugar than we need. But it starts all because our brain, to process, to give rise to mind consciousness, requires a lot of input, a lot of energy input. And so our taste buds have evolved to crave sugar. So mind consciousness is very expensive energy, whereas store consciousness is very efficient, very ecological, very low, requires low energy input. And that is why when we come to a practice center like Deer Park and we eat very simple, healthy food, and we are around people who nourish our seeds of happiness and joy, we feel like we don't need to eat so much. We feel very full. Many people tell me, oh, if I could eat the food at Deer Park, I would be very I would not need to eat so much. But somehow when we go home and we're in our apartment, in maybe a place where we encounter loneliness, anxiety, and fear, those seeds are watered in our consciousness, then somehow we, we find ourselves eating and ingesting more sugars and foods and fats and than we really need. So this is part of this experience that people have in the monastery is reflecting this nature of our mind. In the monastery, we learn to download directly our experiences to store consciousness, to touch the seeds of wisdom that are innate there. Because we are surrounded by a good environment, friendly, kind people. Of course, we have suffering too. And sometimes we don't get along with each other, or sometimes I'm in my language or in my way of acting, I'm not so skillful or kind. And sometimes my brothers, you say something and I feel hurt. But it's very tiny compared to what we can experience out there in the world, outside. So, and that is designed like that. We create an environment where we try to create an optimal environment with optimal conditions for touching our insight. So we try to use all the insights from the Buddhist tradition as well as from science, things that we've learned in our own experience to create an environment where we can just absorb. We don't need to say, I like this and I don't like that. We can just let everything in the monastery in and not worry about whether it will water seeds of anger or fear. And when we do that, most of us when we come here, we're not used to doing that, and sometimes it can take a year or 2 years or even longer because we've built up this kind of armor around ourselves. We've experienced real trauma in the past, and that trauma has caused us to close our heart. And so when we come to a place where people are kind and friendly, we see danger all around us. There's no one around us who wants to kill us. There's no one around us who wants to take our money, to steal from us, or engage in sexual misconduct with us. And yet we feel that way. We feel fear because of our past experience. And so we can, and I've seen many times friends come to the monastery and they're looking around, scared. Why are people being friendly? Why are people being nice? And sometimes we can come to the monastery and we experience a lot of joy and happiness, but the longer we are here, the more we start to look more in a very refined way at life at Deer Park, and we start to see things that are not so beautiful. And those not so beautiful things, they become the main part of our vision. And we forget entirely about all the other good conditions that are around us. So I shared in the past classes about the teaching of Zen Master Guishan that we study as novices, which talks about walking through the meadow, which is covered with morning dew, and it naturally soaks our sleeve. So we don't have to make any effort. We just walk through the meadow and our sleeves become covered, saturated with the dew. So that is the practice in the monastery. We don't have to exert a lot of effort with mind consciousness. When I came to the monastery, I wanted to get the maximum benefit. And so I spent a lot of time in the library reading sutras and trying to learn better Sanskrit or Pali and all these things. But now I look back at that with a lot of kind of regret that I didn't spend more time just hanging out with my brothers and sisters. That's what I try to practice now more. It's just to sit and have tea with the brothers and cultivate brotherhood and sisterhood. And not, because actually all those good qualities were there and are there in my brothers and sisters. And I can get them, I can incorporate them into my own practice more efficiently just by being around them. But somehow I think, well, what I'm learning in the book, in the sutra, is more important than the person who's sitting right next to me. So now slowly over the years, I began to learn the importance of spending time with my monastic brothers and sisters. That I can get a lot of joy, a lot of energy. Those seeds of wisdom can come in directly, and I don't have to exert a lot of energy with mind consciousness to try to comprehend the abstruse nature of the Dhamma. But the Dhamma is there in every moment, within me and around me. And if I just relax my body by being aware of my breath, that I can let the Dhamma in. I can see that the Dhamma is already there in store consciousness. And I just need to use the practice of mindfulness, concentration and insight to allow that innate seed of the Dhamma to manifest in mind consciousness. And that doesn't take a lot of effort or exertion. So we go back to our model of the mind, which is, as we remember, only a model. And we talk about the store consciousness as being the sum of all the seeds. And when we say seeds, we mean latent tendencies. So things that are already there, potentialities. But they're not yet manifested in our mind consciousness. So all of us are born with seeds of anger, fear, and despair, as well as mindfulness, wisdom, compassion. They're all there. And we may think of ourselves as a kind person, or a cynical person, or a skeptical person, or a loving person. But the truth is that all those seeds are there in every one of us. And actually, when we step back a little bit from the closeness of our relationships, we see that all human beings are all the time manifesting different aspects of these potentialities. Even if it just means not bumping into someone when we walk through a room, that means there's understanding and compassion. Even though we might not say, that is a very compassionate person. But they know how to interact with another person in a way that they don't create pain. So there is some compassion and understanding, just in avoiding bumping into someone, something we might do automatically. I remember a teaching I find very joyful. There was I think it was a Theravada monk, and he went to a Zen center, and one student asked him a question. That student suffered so much because he tried to cultivate generosity, but every time he wanted to give something to someone, he would think right away about why he needed that thing, and he couldn't give it to the other person. And so he just couldn't get himself to give anything. It was so difficult for him to cultivate generosity. And so that monk said, he told him, okay, take this apple. So the man took the apple and he said, okay, you take it in your left hand, now put it in your right hand. I said, okay. He said, okay, now take the apple from your right hand and put it in your left hand. And so he did that. And he said, now keep doing that. Keep practicing. Your left hand will give it to your right hand. Your right hand will give it to your left hand. And then eventually, you'll be able to give it to someone else's hand. So even we think that the seed of generosity is not there in us, but if we look carefully, it is there, and we can train it. We can grow that generosity. The same with compassion. And so what we call store consciousness is just, it might sound like something quite grand, and it is quite important for us to understand the nature of our mind. But the important thing to remember is that store consciousness is all the seeds. So there's no like a container and then you have the seeds in there. But it is itself the seeds, the potentialities. And what we'll learn today is that mind consciousness is born from store consciousness. That means that mind consciousness is another potentiality. And when we know how to cultivate good conditions, mind consciousness will sprout up out of the store, the repository of seeds. So we have a seed of mind consciousness. And when we know how to nurture that, for example, when our mother and father come together and the sperm and the egg are joined and a fetus begins to develop, that means that the consciousness of the fetus, of the child, it starts to manifest. It starts to grow, just like the seed of anger or fear or jealousy. So store consciousness is sometimes called, it has many names, but one of its names is Mula Vijnana. It means the root consciousness. Mula is root. And so just like anger or sadness or jealousy, mind consciousness needs food, some kind of nutriment in order to manifest. Maybe we can listen to the sound of the bell. So the Buddhist teacher and practitioner Vasubandhu, in a text called the 30 Verses on consciousness only or manifestation only, noted that as had been realized by many practitioners as well before him, that mind consciousness is absent in certain situations. For example, when we're in a coma or deep sleep, then mind consciousness is not present, but store is always there, very constant. So that helped him get the insight that store is a root consciousness, and mind consciousness manifests from that root. In fact, to call these processes store and mind is for the sake of practice. It's not for the sake of saying, well, this is different from that. It's for the sake of awakening. So we use the image of a gardener. Mind consciousness is the awareness of the gardener who then tills the soil, which is the store consciousness. It has all the seeds. And he knows how to water the earth. He knows how to make good use of the sun. And sometimes he knows to protect the seedling in a greenhouse, a little bit like the monastery. You kind of have a protected area where you can grow the very delicate seedlings, and then you can plant them in the earth, and they can grow and put down their roots and become strong. So in this image, mind consciousness is the gardener, and store consciousness is the earth. It's all the potentialities of what can grow in the garden. And when we are skillful at bringing up the seeds of mindfulness and concentration and insight, it means those potentialities that are there in store consciousness, we know how to bring them up so they manifest in our mind consciousness as a flower. Then we are able to be happier, we're able to enjoy the fruits, the delicious fruits. We favor the good qualities, like awakening in our store consciousness. And we learn how not to feed or nourish seeds like anger and fear, not because we hate them, but because we know that those seeds can cause so much suffering and despair in ourselves and in others. And to practice the Buddhist teaching is to choose happiness. It's not to reject suffering, it's to understand that to really be happy, we need to understand our suffering, the nature of suffering. So when these qualities of mindfulness, concentration, and insight that we've been studying for many weeks, when they are in our mind consciousness, then learning can happen. And we download that learning, that information, those insights to store. And store of its own, without
really any effort on our part, very, very little effort, store very efficiently, matures those seeds. Just like the seeds that in the earth start to put up small first leaves and put down the root into the soil. So yeah, it's quite magical. But somehow we don't know, we don't see ourselves as a wise person, we don't see ourselves perhaps as a very mindful person, but when we are put in an environment where we create an environment, like by having a day of mindfulness, where we slow down, enjoy every step with mindfulness, follow our breathing, maybe for 10 seconds or 15 seconds or a minute, then we actually allow our innate wisdom to manifest. So it doesn't come from outside of us. I love to sit in the Dhamma talks of my teacher, Tai, our teacher. And over time, as I sat there, I realized Tai is not making me wise. Tai is just helping me to see that wisdom is already there in my heart. At first I saw Tai is a great Zen master and I'm just a student and I come to learn from the from the master. And I practice diligently and I just kind of let it soak it in. But over time, just letting the words of the Dhamma come into my consciousness, then I noticed that actually Tai is just helping me to do the work, to point out how to make good use of those qualities that I already have. That is a transmission. It's not like Tai is giving me wisdom. That is not the job of the teacher. The job of the teacher is to clear away, help us clear away our ignorance of our own innate wisdom. That is the beauty of the Dhamma. And the Buddha also said that he is just clearing away an old path which is already there. He's not inventing the Dhamma, but he's just a good spiritual friend who helps us to see the path. So usually we use our mind consciousness to learn facts and figures and solve problems. And eventually, by training our mind in that way, we end up getting a job, and in that job we continue to solve problems, and in order to perhaps to make money or to help people. And the monastery provides quite a different opportunity. We're not here to solve a problem. I remember a teacher once told me, if you have a problem, perhaps you are the problem. That was a kind of koan that went very deep in my consciousness. And that's not to criticize, that's to help us to see that sometimes our problem is being caused by our own mind. And that if we let go of the problem, we might be able to dwell happily in the present moment. Or our problem can be much smaller than our mind has made it out to be. So this is the work of our store consciousness to mature the seeds of wisdom that are there that are already there. And as we're learning, those seeds are not just part of us as an individual, but they are there as part of a stream of ancestors. And our ancestors can transmit wisdom and understanding. They also can transmit trauma, fear, and violence. And we are in a good position as practitioners. We have a practice to be able to help us to bring up the seeds of wisdom, understanding, and compassion, and learn not to continue to water those seeds of trauma and suffering and violence, but rather transform them. So our wisdom comes from understanding the seeds of trauma which have been transmitted to us and which we have experienced. But that transformation can take time. So with mindfulness, concentration, and insight, we let go of trying to solve the problem, solve our problem, or solve ourselves as a problem. But rather we just shine the light of mindfulness onto our body, our feelings, our perceptions, our mental formations. And we learn. And what we learn is that these are all impermanent. And they are not us. They are not me. They have the quality of non-self. And that's how we can download to store our insights. And in the last class we learned that if we let manas, remember manas, the lover? So when manas manifests, it gets very attached to those insights of stored consciousness. It wants to think these insights are me, mine, or myself. My precious. Yeah, it's like grasping at the insight of this kind of power of insight. So this is why it's so important to keep the seed of mindfulness up in our mind consciousness. So that way manas cannot continue its usual habit of grasping at those insights and thinking that they are me, mine, or myself. So we let it flow naturally. Just shine the light of awareness. And one other name for stored consciousness is vipaka, or ripening or maturation. Pach is to cook something. You cook it so it becomes cooked. But when we say vipaka, it means like a fruit that becomes ripe, ready to eat. So this is the term maturation, which is translated here as maturation, vipaka. Vipaka sarva bijaka. Sarva bijaka, all the seeds, the ripening of all the seeds in stored consciousness. So our mindfulness is like the sunlight shining on the earth, which has water in the right temperature, and then the leaves put themselves up and they photosynthesize the light from our awareness and continue to grow and become stronger. And this is the daily practice. It's not so complicated. We study the nature of the mind not for the sake of our just curiosity about psychology or understanding natural science. We study it in order to transform. And that's the beauty of the practice. Buddhism is not just a philosophy of the mind. it is a directed practice of transforming, of of maturing the seeds of happiness and joy in our consciousness so they grow up and become stronger and more established in our mind consciousness. So all of these models are they're just examples. How we try to find the, I know in my own mind, I've learned through the years how to recognize what kind of seeds I'm touching in store consciousness through my awareness. What I pay attention to, my eyes, my ears, my nose, and so forth. A lot of time, our sense impressions are just going straight into store consciousness. When we don't have mindfulness, concentration, or insight, we just absorb things like sexy advertisements or romantic love songs that we hear in the grocery store. And we're not aware that those are watering the seeds of attachment or fear or sexual desire in our consciousness. There's no mindfulness of that. But with practice, we start to see that, oh gosh, I'm very aware now because I live in a monastery. When I go in the grocery store down in town and they're playing a romantic song, as I kind of walk through the aisle, and I feel like, suddenly I feel very joyful and I want to buy, I want to put things in my shopping cart. So I know what's to stop and recognize what's going on. Through my ear consciousness, the seed of romantic sexual desire is being watered in my store consciousness. And I was not mindful of it, because the seed of mindfulness was not present. And so I don't know why I feel so happy, so excited and joyful. Is it because there's someone singing to me, and I think that they're saying you and me, and is it me? Is she talking to me? Does she feel those feelings for me? Oh, wow, I feel so special. And that's all happening in an unconscious way. So this is how we have to be very vigilant. And now we can pick up any device and immediately start downloading without any awareness these sense impressions, going straight into touch, these latencies, the potentialities in store. So mindfulness, concentration, and insight are our protection. They help us to see what seeds are being watered by the sense impressions that come in through our eyes, our ears, and so forth. So this is for the purpose of being a good, skillful gardener of our mind. And it's very beautiful, this term maturation or ripening, because these processes take time. At any moment we can stop, come back to our breathing, come back to our body. But to train ourselves to do that regularly and to, throughout the day, bring up awareness that stops us from acting or saying things or thinking things that water the seeds of despair in ourselves or in other people, takes training, takes time. So we have to be patient, knowing that we are on the path. As Tai said, we have a path, so we no longer have to fear. So we know that we still have suffering, the suffering of our ancestors. We still have a lot of fear, jealousy, and anger, but we're on a path. And we know that the seeds of compassion and joy are ripening because we have chosen to put ourselves in the kind of environment where the seeds of mindfulness, concentration, and insight are being watered and coming up every day. And in that way, we no longer just senselessly absorb all kinds of sense impressions which water seeds of despair and anger and so forth. So instead, for example, with mindfulness, I hear the romantic song in the grocery store and I smile with awareness of impermanence. I say, well, first of all, I know that it's just a recording and that person is not singing to me. So I already say, okay, first of all, yeah, I do not believe that that person is suddenly in love with me, who's singing on the megaphone or on the speakers. But also I know that from experience that a romantic relationship is very complicated. And sometimes it's very wonderful and it's so joyful, and sometimes it's very difficult and painful. And so I listen to those words with my awareness and the wisdom that comes from experience with relationships in the past helps to look with the eyes of impermanence at those words and see, so I don't get caught. So instead of having the music, the romantic words touch the seeds of sensual desire in my consciousness, instead they touch the seeds of wisdom. So that's what's going on here. With mindfulness, concentration, and insight, mind consciousness can learn and download its insights to store. And then I'm safe. With mindfulness, I'm safe. I'm not caught in a delusion or infatuation. We might be having a difficult moment with our loved one, and we hear a love song, and then suddenly we feel, oh, but I still love him, and I still... we can forget entirely about that suffering, and then we go back, and then that person abuses us or says cruel things over again, but we hear the song and we come back again. And so instead of transforming the situation of violence and abuse, we are caught in our infatuation. So mindfulness can help to break that cycle of infatuation. It helps us to open ourselves to see that, to return ourselves to our dignity as a human being, and know that we will not continue to live in a situation where those kind of abusive words are used for us, because the words of the other person may become the words of our own thinking, and we start to believe over time what the other person says. So that is how, for example, we can use mindfulness to touch insight, and we change our environment. We see that this person says those words not because they are horrible, but because they suffer so much. But we don't have the capacity, we cannot continue to be in that situation, to have that kind of abuse. So we need to remove ourselves from that situation. That's the seed of wisdom, so that we can grow and learn how to have time to mature the seeds of compassion and understanding. And then maybe in a future time we can come back to that, to our loved one, and we have the capacity not to let those words go straight in and water the seeds of despair, but rather embrace the words with mindfulness. See right away that that person is suffering, and embrace their actions with compassion. And they may be so surprised. They wonder, what happened? How come we don't react like we used to? Arguing back or blaming back with anger. Instead, we just smile with compassion. We breathe mindfully, and we know that this person is suffering, and the abuse that they cause to us is the product of their suffering. And we help them to transform. So maybe in the future we will be in a place to do that, but now we need to change our environment and practice to cultivate mindfulness. So that is an example of how we can practice to use mind consciousness to download, to learn and download its insights into store. Another way I like to talk about store is as, kind of restoring our dignity. Somehow store maintains always our humanity, even in the most difficult, painful situations like torture or violence. Somehow we can go very deep, and there's still a sense of humanness that store maintains, even when it seems like we have become completely cut off from or near to our humanity. Those potentialities in store are still there. We can listen to sound of the bell. So we can entrust the work to store consciousness. The beauty of this understanding for me is that we allow the innate goodness of human beings to be fully recognized and manifest. In some traditions, we talk about we have the tendency, because the seed of despair or violence has been nourished in us, we may come to the view that human beings are innately bad and sinful. This understanding of Buddhist psychology clearly demonstrates that the mind is inherently good. People are inherently good. And it is just our attachment that causes this kind of these kind of painful actions. Our greed, our jealousy. And so we can see that those are just seeds in store consciousness. And if we continue to water them, they will continue to manifest. So how can we learn not to water the seeds of jealousy? How do we take care of our thinking so that we don't water the seeds of jealousy or fear or attachment? Because so long as we water those potentialities, then they will continue to manifest and drive us to say things or do things based on fear or jealousy. So, first of all, we try to find an environment where people are kind, where they practice letting go, becoming free of attachment. When you're around someone like that, you feel very light and free. I know being around my teacher, I felt like that, very, very free. And I try to practice to be like that, but I'm not always like that. So I continue on the path. But I know I remember one of Suko Shankong, who is a great Zen master and teacher, but also a disciple of Tai, our teacher. One time we were in a monastic day, and she said, "Tai was not always the beautiful flower you see today." And when I heard that statement, I felt, oh, okay, I can feel a little bit of compassion for myself, because I know that I'm not always the beautiful flower. But I want to go in that direction. Yeah, I want to water the seeds of compassion and understanding to be more fresh and light and free. And so I follow the path that my teacher set out, so that I can, the seeds of anger and fear become less and less strong, and seeds like compassion and so forth can be stronger. And I entrusted that work to store, so I don't put a lot of energy and effort in mind consciousness to do that. I found you cannot think your way out of your suffering. You can try, but it doesn't work. Somehow it always bounces back. Yeah. That's why when we try to avoid suffering, it doesn't work. So the better way is to embrace the suffering with mindfulness. That's how we learn and download it to store consciousness. And then the work of maturation and transformation happens even while we're sleeping. When we are able to have that flower of mindfulness, of concentration and insight present for longer periods during the day, the maturation continues to go on, and the learning and the insight and the wisdom become stronger. So this is a very helpful tenet in terms of training our mind and not having to use so much energy to bring about transformation. And I didn't find that worked. When I started practicing Zen, I thought, okay, sitting on a cushion, I can do this. I'll just sit here and I'll suffer. But I'll continue to sit. No, even if I suffer for hours and hours, I knew I had that kind of determination. But I noticed that even with all my energy, I was only engaging in a kind of spiritual athleticism. It's kind of like I used to run cross-country and track, so I felt like I was training for a cross-country race by just sitting for hours and hours on the cushion. But actually, I was not doing much of this work. I was not entrusting. Somehow I didn't have the confidence in the innate goodness of store consciousness, of my own humanity. I still somehow was caught in the idea that I'm a bad person and I have to transform myself. I have to overcome my sinfulness. And now I have a lot of trust for store consciousness. A lot of trust. Because I've seen the maturation. I've seen the fruit of this maturation. And I tasted the happiness and the joy. That's the way you know you're on the good path. You feel the happiness, the lightness, the joy. When that's there, you know that store consciousness is doing the work of maturation. And all you need to do is just continue to bring up the seed of mindfulness, concentration and insight. So thank you for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy your stay here in Clarity Hamlet and Deer Park. And I wish you a lot of joy and happiness on the practice.